This is Easter week, and we're talking about the cross. We're talking about Gethsemane and everything Jesus did when he died on the cross for you and for me. And there's some pretty interesting things in the Bible that most people don't talk about on Easter week. And one of them is the naked boy in the Garden of Gethsemane. Who was the naked kid in the Garden of Gethsemane? You might be one of those people who say, what? There was a naked boy in the Garden of Gethsemane? That's what the Bible says. Listen to what it says. Mark chapter 14, verse 51. And there followed him a certain young man having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. You ever seen that before? And there followed him a certain young man having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young men laid hold on him. And verse 52 says, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Well, you know, I was trying to figure this out. Who is the naked boy in the Garden of Gethsemane? So I was studying all kinds of writers, and some of them said, well, this was Mark. And Mark somehow wanted to paint himself into the story of Gethsemane, so this was Mark just kind of adding himself to the story. That's crazy. Can you imagine painting yourself into the story of Gethsemane as a naked boy? That didn't make any sense. Then somebody else said that it was John, and that John had slept and somehow slipped out of his clothes and came running into the middle of this scene. I don't think that's the answer. None of these answers satisfied me. So I pulled out my Greek New Testament, and guess what I found out? The word linen cloth is the answer. He had a linen cloth wrapped around his naked body. Rich Jews, when they buried their dead, always buried them in linen cloths that were made in Egypt and were brought from Egypt. And there was only one Greek word to describe these linen cloths, and this Greek word wasn't used to describe any other kind of a linen cloth. It was a burial shroud, very expensive, fabricated in Egypt and brought to Israel. Well, if you've ever been to Israel, and if you've ever been to the Garden of Gethsemane, you know that all around the Garden of Gethsemane there is an ancient cemetery. It's a huge, huge cemetery. In fact, there are graves all up and down the side of that mountain. And right around the Garden of Gethsemane are the very oldest part of that big cemetery. Well, on this particular night, when Jesus spoke those words, I am he, ego eimi, which means I am that I am, there was such a blast of divine power that came out of his mouth. We already saw that the Bible says that a whole band of soldiers fell backward onto the ground. That's 300 to 600 soldiers. We're talking about a blast of divine power that is just almost beyond our imagination. Well, the same blast of power that knocked all the soldiers to the ground, that same blast of power touched a little boy that had just been laid in his grave. The Jews buried the dead naked, and if they were rich, they covered them with a linen cloth. Now this boy has been accidentally raised from the dead. Think about it. Jesus has so much power, he accidentally raised somebody from the dead. He comes crawling out of his grave, just as all these soldiers are starting to stand back up on their feet. And those from the chief priests and the officers and all the soldiers, they see that here is another resurrection. This is even going to create more news about Jesus. Somebody screams and says, somebody get that kid, because the last thing they needed was another miracle. And this boy stood there holding his linen cloth. He had just been raised from the dead. And the Bible says he fled from them. They reached out to get him, but he slipped away from them, and those soldiers stood there holding the linen cloth of a boy that had just been raised from the dead. You know, they really did not have the power to arrest Jesus. They didn't have the power to take him. He knocked them flat with his words. His power was so strong he accidentally raised somebody from the dead. Jesus willingly gave himself. The Bible says they took him. He gave himself. They wrapped a rope around him, and they led him to Caiaphas the high priest, just like a lamb is led to slaughter. Jesus gave his life that night for me and for you. Jesus' power is amazing. There's nothing that he wouldn't do for you. He'll even release power in your life accidentally if you'll let him get close enough. Just like this little boy that was raised from the dead that night in the Garden of Gethsemane.